So now that everything is defined, so the next step is the mesh module. The mesh module is probably the most important, one of the most important modules actually, and this is where you can tell actually the difference between a professional and just a beginner user of finite element. So you have to make your mesh the proper size, the proper dimensions. You shouldn't have like any distorted mesh elements, so you need to make sure that everything is correct. This will make it easier, of course. Once you start running the analysis, you will not get errors, you will not get problems with conversions and so on. Of course, we did like the most preparation work as part of the partitioning that we did for our different parts. So now our task becomes easier right now for doing the meshing. So right now we're in the mesh module, and over here these are all the different icons that we are going to use to define our mesh. So basically right now I see the assembly. So right now this is what's selected, the entire assembly, but we are not going to mesh the entire assembly in one shot. We are going to mesh each part individually. So this is similar to what we have defined earlier when we defined instances. We said that we are going to mesh dependent on the part. So if I go here and click on part, so now I can toggle between the different parts, and I can define my mesh. So let's start with the beam perhaps, because the beam is the shell element, and perhaps this is the easiest one to do. So what we need to do with respect to the mesh, we need to do a couple of things. We need to set the size of the mesh, the type of the mesh, and the controls, perhaps like how the meshing, what mesh algorithm would be used to mesh the part. The first two, the size and the type, these are very important. The third one, the mesh algorithm, this is only you need to define, or perhaps you need to go into this if you have some complex shape or you are not getting the proper meshing in your part. So let's start first by the size. So in the size you have these two controls over here. So the first one is the seed part. Okay, so this, if you click on it, you can create seeds. So seeds meaning you need to define like the nodes that constitutes the corners of your mesh element. So what would be the size of these mesh elements? And over here, this other icon, this is seed edges. So if you want to, the first one is pretty much the global seed for the entire part, but if you want to seed or specify the mesh element, or the by size or by number for a specific location, then you use the second one. So let's start with the first one. This is the general one. So you click here, then you get this dialog that tells you what would be the approximate global size. So the global size, well, this depends on your dimensions over here. So right now I have, if you remember, we have the width of this flange, if I remember correctly, was like about 120 millimeter. So this means half of the flange is 60 millimeter. So I think if I have like 3 or 4 elements across half of the flange, that would be a reasonable size. So roughly, if this is 60 millimeter, if you divide this by 3 or by 4, you get around like maybe 15 millimeters. So I can set here the global size as 15. The other things, those are for curvature control and pretty much so that you don't get any distorted mesh elements. So I can leave those as they are. You don't need to play with those. The default values would, in most cases, are just fine. So before I click OK, I can just click apply to see how this looks like. And you see here, once I click apply, you can see an indication here of the mesh elements. So as you see here, these are the points. So you see that half of the flange will be divided into 4 elements pretty much. Okay, and the same thing in all the directions. So pretty much these dimensions are roughly 15. Okay, so the algorithm works like in order to make the approximate global size. That's why it says approximate over here. So that seems fine, and then I can click OK. All right. In the same time, if I want to modify, perhaps I want to decrease or increase the number of elements across the edge, then you can do the seed edges. So if you click on that, then you can select the edges that you want to modify. So let's say I want to modify these edges, for instance. So I select all the edges. Of course, you want to select all the edges in the same direction, because if you modify ones and you don't modify the others, then you are going to get asymmetric shapes of meshing, which doesn't look nice. And then I can click on done, and then here I can specify exactly like what would be the size across these edges. So instead of 15, perhaps I want to make it more, because I don't need more the size here. I can relax it more in the longitudinal direction. Perhaps I can specify this by number. So I can say that, okay, across this length, I want exactly to have 50 or 30 elements. Okay, so I can be very specific. And actually, if you go to constraints over here, if you go to constraints, whatever the value that you specify here, if you specify this by number, you can allow the meshing algorithm to modify this number in order to accommodate other things in the algorithm. Or if you want to be strict, you can say, okay, don't allow the number of elements to change. So I want those to be 30 elements exactly, assuming that this is what you want. So you can modify that here if you want by using the seed edges. But for now, I don't want to do that. I will just leave the global one. At the same time, if you did seed any of these edges and then you changed your mind, by clicking on this icon, you can select this second one, and then you can delete the edge seeds. So you can select the same edges and then you delete whatever that you have specified earlier. So that's with respect to the mesh size. So that's fine. Now the second thing that we want to do is to assign the mesh element. So this is the icon